In this lecture, we're going to look at diversity issues in relation to the criminal justice system in America. While many of the facts and figures and points that we're going to look at in this particular lecture are ones that we've touched on in other learning units earlier in the semester, nonetheless, it may be helpful to mention them again in this particular context, perhaps to help you pull together a few ideas about how all of this relates to diversity and minority populations. Before we get going in this particular topic, I again want to go back to a basic sociological concept about what deviance is all about. Deviant behavior in sociological terms is not necessarily a negative concept as it is generally in our discourse in society. In other words, when we talk about deviant behavior, usually we're considering something that is less than appropriate, less than acceptable, and yet in sociological terms, deviant behavior is a neutral term, and it just means that a behavior is a variation from the norm. It doesn't imply right or wrong necessarily. And what is considered deviant depends upon the culture and the context in which that behavior occurs. So it varies from culture to culture and situation to situation, and that's because the norms in cultures and sometimes in particular situations are different. I've talked about streaking as an example of when running around nude might be considered funny and perhaps acceptable or comically deviant, perhaps in certain situations, but nudity in public in other situations, such as one sauntering down the hallway in a classroom building, is going to get you arrested. And in fact, public nudity in any situation, including humorous streaking, would probably get you a death sentence in some of the more strict cultures in the Middle East, for instance. So deviant behavior, what is deviant, is very, very dependent upon the situation and upon the culture. And then within that culture, deviant behavior can be considered a number of different things as well. It can be considered a mental health issue. It can be considered a sin. It can be considered a law violation, or it might be something just different. It depends on the culture and the context. And also here, I want to point out, it also depends upon who's in charge. And so the systems of inequality grow from that very fact. Those in the majority tend to define what is deviant and what isn't, and how that deviant behavior is going to be responded to. It's interesting to note that in most cultures, what's considered a sin is also considered to be a law violation by the civil society in that same culture, and religion and government go hand in hand there in that respect. Another concept, minority status, isn't based upon numbers, it's based upon relative power. And so deviance in that context then becomes an issue of social justice, because minorities are oftentimes disproportionately represented among those held in mental hospitals and in correctional institutions. This particular lecture is going to focus upon the definition of deviant behavior as a law violation rather than as a mental health issue or anything like that. And we're going to take a good bit of time looking at how that results in the use of the correctional system in our society. As you can see here, the United States incarcerates a larger share of its population than any other country, really by quite a distance. In fact, you can see that Russia, Turkmenistan, Brazil, and Thailand are the only nations that even come close to the incarceration rate that the United States has. But at the same time, the incarceration rate in the United States has fallen in 2016 to its lowest level in over 20 years. But despite the decline, the U.S. is still incarcerating a much larger share of its population than any other country. At the end of 2016, 2.2 million people were behind bars in the United States, and about 1.5 million of them were in federal or state prisons, and another 750,000 roughly were in locally run jails. Our incarceration rate was about 860 prison or jail inmates for every 100,000 adults ages 18 or older. Over the period of history, deviant behavior has been handled differently, and how it was dealt with oftentimes may have been vicious and barbaric, at least in pre-scientific times. And this was justified by the understanding at that time that deviant behavior was a product of evil influences somehow. So, for instance, the Salem witch trials are a good example of that, although that also has a lot of other implications about gender that we won't have time to go into here. In the colonies, justice was swift and unyielding, very quickly decided how to deal with deviant behavior. But the Age of Enlightenment in the 18th century, relatively speaking, comes along, and the notion developed then that human beings could be perfected. And there were religious groups such as Quakers or other individuals that we've touched on previously, such as Dorothea Dix, who argued for more humane facilities for the deviant, the criminals, and the mentally deficient. In the United States, the philosophy for corrections eventually evolved into the belief that first crime could be measured in severity, that prevention was more important than punishment, that the purpose of punishment was deterrence, not revenge, and that incarceration should segregate prisoners so as to not exacerbate the lawlessness of those who were incarcerated. In the 1840s, or around that period of time, the concept of probation was developed as an alternative to prison time. There have been different attempts over the years to apply science to the concept of deviant behavior, particularly efforts being made to apply that science of human beings to behaviors in a way that might predict deviance and might help us manage violations of the norms before they occurred. And here are a few of the ways that we've tried to use what's on the surface to unearth what is mentioned here as the monsters underneath. The first science that was mentioned here was phrenology. And a theorist by the name of Gall said that he believed the brain was comprised of, I think it was 17 separate different organs, and each of those organs within the brain was responsible for certain behavioral traits. So the followers of this theory then would search for those parts in the skulls of criminals that might result in behaviors that led to deviance. And this science persisted into the 1900s. Cesar Lombroso, who was called the father of criminology, developed the theory of degeneration. Lombroso studied the structure of the skulls of deceased criminals and found some oddities in many of those skulls and believed that those features, those physical features, were associated with the different types of crime that were committed by the criminals that he was examining. This theory faded from popularity in the early 20th century, but there was for a period of time this belief that you could predict criminal behavior by the shape of skulls. Somatotypes. Now, you might have studied this in your psychology, introductory psychology classes. In the early 20th century, Sheldon studied body types of college students and came up with 3 different types of bodies: endomorph, the mesomorph, and the ectomorph. And the endomorph was the heavy-set person, the ectomorph was the very thin person, tall and thin, and the mesomorph was kind of that muscular build that you see with some individuals. And Sheldon's theories associated different kinds of behaviors and emotional factors that went with each of those particular body types. So the personality types developed from that. And of those theories, mesomorphs, for instance, were thought to be more predisposed to impulsivity, and this would likely lead to more criminal behavior. Finally, another biological theory or biological feature that was considered as contributing to deviancy was the XYY syndrome, where there was that extra Y chromosome among males. This individual has been referred to as the super male, and this extra chromosome might somehow cause violence and aggression in those men, or so it was thought at least. This theory, I don't think, has necessarily been dispelled entirely, but it does just remain a theory, as well as the slide suggests, a convenient plot device in many different fictional tales. The eugenics movement evolved before World War II, and as we've discussed earlier, was really the basis for Hitler's pursuit of the master race. That theory that we could refine the genetic makeups of human beings to improve the strength of the human creature became very popular worldwide. It grew out of Darwinian theory of the survival of the fittest, of course. As oftentimes happens, this theory was taken too far, and proponents of eugenics advocated for the sterilization of those individuals, those mental defectives, for instance, who were exhibiting deviant behavior. By the mid-50s, more than 58,000 mental patients and convicts had been involuntarily sterilized because of the belief in this particular movement. And then when the civil rights movement came around in the 50s and the 60s, it really helped to call attention to the fact that many of the victims of the sterilization were persons of color or women. As the nation began to recognize that more and more persons incarcerated were racial minorities, then the notion that crime was an organic factor started to become unpopular once again. A population that was victimized by social injustices rather than a group of individuals put in place because of physical defects or anomalies. The cost of criminal justice is great, primarily funded, of course, by your state and local tax dollars, and it varies from state to state quite widely. But as a result, inmates oftentimes are sent, sometimes out of state, to lower cost facilities, and this causes all sorts of problems in terms of contact with family and that type of thing. This cost of prison is about $22,000 per person per year, but I would again say that that varies from state to state pretty widely. That's an average that this particular source had nationwide. The Center for American Progress says that Black Americans and Black men in particular are overrepresented as perpetrators of crime by the media in the United States. This is especially true when you look at the incidence of violent crime. One study, for instance, of a late-night news outlets in New York City in 2014 found that the media reported on murder, theft, and assault in which Black people were suspects at a rate that far outpaced their actual arrest rates for those crimes. Further, the media also tends to vilify Black people by presenting Black crime suspects as more threatening than their white counterparts through such things as showing their mugshots more frequently than the mugshots of white suspects, depicting Black suspects in police custody more often on television, and paying greater attention to cases where the victim is a stranger. And even to add to the problem with stoking fear towards Black people, the media further worsens racial tensions between Black and white people by perpetuating the narrative of white victimization when, in fact, homicide, for instance, is largely an intra-racial crime, whites on whites and blacks on blacks, and not blacks on whites. But the news media over-reports those less common cases of Black people committing homicide against whites. Even though personal and property crimes have fallen in the United States, incarceration, probation, and parole have all increased dramatically at the same time. In 2009, nearly 7.25 million persons were either incarcerated or on probation or parole. About 90% of inmates are male, about 2/3 are persons of color, about half of all inmates are African American, and in 2002, 12% of African American men aged 20 to 34 were incarcerated. Hate crimes is a particular concern when it comes to minorities, and they are classified into categories based on race, religion, sexual orientation, ethnicity, and disability. In 2013, there were about 6,000 documented hate crimes. The FBI reported that almost half of them were motivated by race. About a fifth of them were based on sexual orientation, and over 17%, or almost another fifth, were due to religious bias. There's a quote by an assistant professor of psychology at UAA from February 2019 that states that hate crimes in Anchorage and Alaska in general is almost non-existent, at least statistically. Now, I wonder if that is indeed the case. I can think of certainly a few stories where there were paintball attacks, for instance, on Native males in Anchorage some years ago. And I don't know, perhaps it's rarer than I suspect, but this quote actually surprises me a little. But he goes on to say, this doesn't mean that it doesn't happen in Alaska, but it's just probably underreported. Whether victims are staying silent or law enforcement data isn't representative, the numbers for reported hate crimes are routinely low, Professor David said. If you Google the term driving while black, I think it will take you to a study that was done some years ago in the New Jersey Turnpike. And if I remember correctly, the state troopers were aware of the fact that their arrests were being monitored for this particular study at the time. And still, the number of black motorists that were pulled over by police during that study exceeded by far the number of times that whites were pulled over. And a lot of people believe that this is a flashpoint in the national debate, that there's a troubling message with this, that if you're black, you don't belong here. There was another study done, I believe, by Stanford University here that's quoted. It says in 19 of 24 states studied, black Americans are more likely to be stopped than whites. After they have been pulled over, black Americans are more likely to be searched in all but one of those states studied, even though they're no more likely to be carrying illegal substances. Black Americans are more likely than whites to be ticketed after a stop in all but 2 of these states, and black Americans were more likely than whites to be arrested after a stop in all 13 states in that particular study. This is something that is repeated in all sorts of different kinds of comparisons of arrests and incarceration and convictions, as we've talked about earlier in the semester, I believe. We talk about juvenile crime, and diversion might be the most effective way to keep kids from becoming adult offenders. For instance, in Massachusetts, recidivism was found to be much lower in those districts with strong community-based alternatives to institutionalization. Research in Massachusetts suggested that the longer children are institutionalized in youth facilities because of their behaviors, the more likely they were to become serious adult offenders later. Nonetheless, we continue to lean upon incarceration as an answer to youth crime and youth deviance. Since the 1930s, efforts were made to strengthen the response to juvenile offenders, and as a result of that, in some states now, youths are incarcerated as adults and are then one-third more likely to be rearrested for another crime. Youthful offenders who are incarcerated, even if they're put in juvenile facilities, have often been the subjects of mistreatment in facilities around the United States. In 2019, there was reports of bodies being dug up in what used to be the Dozier School or the Florida School for Boys in Marianna, Florida. And I remember when I worked in child protection and worked around adolescents who were on the fringes of the juvenile justice system, even then in the 1970s and 1980s, kids knew you didn't want to get sent to Marianna. That was sort of the ultimate in punishment. And now we find that those children were mistreated quite seriously in those days. And if you really do some reading about that, you'll find that there was segregation with the black kids and the white kids in that facility, and the white children were given preferable jobs. The black children were put in jobs working fields, for instance, much like slaves. It's very, very interesting to read these stories. And while this might be an extreme example of the kinds of mistreatment effected with troubled youth in these facilities, it's certainly not something that occurred in only one location. The concept of the school-to-prison pipeline says that minority youth are inducted into the correctional system because of the way schools handle troubled behaviors. Particularly since schools have increasingly had law enforcement officers in place to protect students from assaults, I suppose, as well as to encourage students to develop positive relationships with law enforcement. Nonetheless, their presence in schools seems to contribute to higher arrest rates of children in schools. And black males are twice as likely to be arrested after they've been engaged in an altercation at school. They have a suspension rate of 20% compared to a 7% suspension rate for white males. Oftentimes, students are expelled from school under zero tolerance policies for infractions that are really very minor, things like disrespect to school staff, failing to abide by behavior codes, or having over-the-counter medications at school. Any criminal record, of course, hampers or even prevents getting hired in legitimate employment, and if you're incarcerated, that makes it even more difficult, as well as leading to disruptions in family life. So ultimately, these young people are groomed for a life of economic marginalization. In addition to that, those kids that get expelled from school are more likely to have weaker academic school skills, so that while they get hurt, the schools are aided by their expulsion because their performance measures improve. As far as drug activity and arrests, black youth are 45% more likely to be arrested than white youth for such problems. Detention facilities for Native American felons are essentially non-existent, and those youth who are arrested for felonies are often incarcerated in federal facilities, while misdemeanor offenders are jailed far away from family and community. Now studies show that for a youth detainee, the average annual cost is about $88,000 per head. This is oftentimes children who are incarcerated that really are posing little or no threat to the public safety at all. So alternative interventions such as providing juveniles and their families with intensive services, some of that community-based services that we were talking about in regards to Massachusetts a few slides back, do show positive results and a reduction in criminal activity. But as one author says, we persist still in sending them to places where they're likely to be victimized and are certain to be isolated, and from which they consistently emerge further disadvantaged. A formula that is custom-made to send them back to prison again and again. And so this concept of the new Jim Crow grows from that. We're not enslaving our black citizens, and particularly our black youth. We set them up for failure, which then has them incarcerated and again separated from society in the mainstream. Race and ethnicity are deeply connected to our incarceration patterns, and racism is institutionalized in our legal system, and so then is institutionalized in our correction system, and this has led to the subjugation of blacks, not unlike the era of slavery and Jim Crow policies that followed that. As I mentioned earlier, crime rates have been falling, an increasing number of blacks are being incarcerated, and the system then permanently marginalizes minorities such that our economic system can be seen more as a racial caste system rather than a class system. I've heard one lecturer refer to the type of circumstances we have today as economic slavery, as opposed to chattel slavery, which is slavery where you possess someone. When we did away with the chattel slavery system in America, we seem to have replaced it with economic slavery. More than half of all black men who drop out of high school go to prison at one time or another in their lives. And so that school-to-prison pipeline that I referred to a few slides back has this as a result. Overall, there are now more people under correctional supervision in America, over 6 million of them, than were in the Gulag archipelago under Stalin at its height. Children are socialized into delinquency and oppositionalism to authority as they grow up in impoverished neighborhoods. Families in these neighborhoods often have a parent who has been an offender, and so a child growing up in such families statistically is more likely to encounter the juvenile justice system. And the punishment of juvenile offenders interferes in their ability to complete school, and so this inhibits the youth's opportunities to build an early employment foundation or to gain useful employment later in life. And so as a result, a lot of times these youth will become engaged in gang activity, bringing arrests and more sentences into their lives. The war on drugs was instituted during the Reagan administration to combat the drive-by shootings and holdups and carjackings that were an effect of drug abuse in the United States during that time. And the funds that were directed towards the war on drugs program were intended to be twofold. One, to interdict the arrival of drugs over the border, to interrupt supply, and then also to provide funds for treatment programs to diminish the demand of drugs coming into the country. But the vast majority of the funds were focused on interdiction, and it was quite unsuccessful. Our crowded prisons, the drug-related arrests account for much of that. In 1980, which would be before the war on drugs was instituted, something close to 41,000 people were incarcerated in the United States for drug offenses, but by 2013, this number had increased to 489,000 people, over tenfold. At the same time, during the Reagan administration, government assistance to cities for social services were reduced, so drug trafficking became even more pronounced, and so this really ruined the inner cities in many respects that were already having problems to begin with. There are studies that have shown the high rates of criminal justice involvement of young African American males, such as the District of Columbia and Baltimore. In 1991, in D.C., 42% of young males and 56% of young African males in Baltimore were in prison, jail, on probation or parole, out on bail, or being sought for arrest. If you're an employer hiring someone, you tend to avoid applicants who have been arrested. So this further dooms those individuals. And there are theorists who believe that the whole definition of crime and how it is applied in our society is really a poorly hidden attempt to control minority youth and minority individuals. Some people will cite what's called a behavioral poverty or a moral poverty among the chronic poor that ensures continued poverty and subverts the efforts of social service programs. William Bennett believes that this all results from growing up abused and neglected at the hands of deviant, delinquent, or criminal adults. So what can be done? Mainstreaming the underclass. Lawlessness declines as rates of employment and marriage rise. Now, this sounds a little bit like moralizing, and I'd like to see more statistics about this, but certainly rates of employment has something to do with lawlessness, and I would assume that rates of marriage also connect somehow. Our prisons have become warehouses for offenders who are judged to represent the highest risk to society. This notion of rehabilitation that we talked about early in the lecture is one of the things we would want to do with corrections in America, has really been replaced by incapacitation. This is the focus of the criminal system, to get people off of the streets and to keep them away from the rest of society. Very little meaningful effort is being done on a system-wide basis towards rehabilitation. Correctional facilities oftentimes now are being turned over to private corporations who are running these prisons that have a financial stake in expanding the criminal market and lead to what some people call the prison industrial complex, a triangle of government bureaucrats, private industry leaders, and politicians who work together to expand the criminal justice system. But if we really want to try to do something to improve the situation for the underclass, we might look at such things as suggested here in this slide, like enhancing educational opportunity. If you read Jonathan Kozol's article, Savage Inequalities, you know a little bit about what this is talking about here. You either start with a disability or an ability when it comes to education. We could improve our inner city schools to meet educational standards better, increase earned income tax credits for the poor to give them a better financial footing, more government-sponsored employment programs, and in general, work to empower the poor to help themselves. As an alternative to criminalization of drug abuse, legalization or at least decriminalization have been considered as alternatives, and little by little across the country, states are beginning to decriminalize or legalize such drugs as marijuana. This can include other drugs as well. Portugal, as you may know, has instituted a program years ago where all drugs were decriminalized, and drug addiction is treated as a public health concern there, not a law violation. And I believe the studies are showing a reduction in drug usage as a result of that and lower costs to society. If we look at alternatives to criminalization, it would free up funds from enforcement to allow us to put them towards prevention and treatment programs. This, of course, assumes that those funds will be put in prevention and treatment programs, and that isn't always the case. But if the savings from a reduction in enforcement activities and in incarceration activities were directly transferred to their population to provide treatment and prevention programs, it may make a big difference. It would also, as mentioned, reduce the prison population and would eliminate the stigma that drug abusers often find in seeking treatment. Whether all drugs should be legalized or decriminalized is a matter of debate, and there's a variety of opinions about this. There are drugs such as crack cocaine and meth, and now opioids are behind an increase in children being placed in foster care. And so whether we want to fully decriminalize or legalize drugs is something that needs to be considered very carefully in our society. There's also a mention here about police violence, again, particularly involving young black men, which is well known to our group and has been discussed in other formats in this class. And this is a national concern. This, for one thing, points to the need for training in non-lethal interventions. Though law enforcement safety remains a concern when dealing with impaired persons, there needs to be stronger training in terms of how to respond to individuals in less confrontive ways, perhaps. This also points to the underlying presumptions about minority individuals that many persons in law enforcement may hold, which may cause them to overreact to perceived threats or to find threats in situations from young black men when they don't really exist. Changing that is a bigger task and a longer-term task, but it's one that we can tackle in a society if we decide to do so. Corrections have become so expensive that other governmental obligations have had their funds limited because of the need to focus it on corrections. And as a result of that, there's been an effort to perhaps punish the criminals even more, only increasing the cost of corrections in the process. One thing that might be done also that might help those who have been released from jail sentences is a change in how employers access criminal records. For instance, one method that could be used would be to delay when the question about law violations is asked in the interview process. For instance, after a possible hire decision is made. Now, employers will need to know if there are arrest records before a person is hired, but once the selection process is completed and the best candidate is selected, then asking the question about criminal histories might enable more individuals that have been incarcerated for varying offenses to actually get hired and have an opportunity to participate in the economy in a productive manner. Too often, because an individual has a criminal history, they're eliminated before they've even been given the opportunity to talk to a potential employer. Other nations are dealing with criminal problems in different ways as well. In fact, many of them have somewhat normalized living environments for inmates, and that's not likely to become very popular in the United States. It's kind of like the proposal to provide homes for the homeless. While that certainly seems to be the sensible thing to do and the humane thing to do, there's such a strong opposition to that among individuals because we believe they should be working for their home like the rest of us. And likewise, then I could see where providing normalized living environments for inmates in the current social and political environment in this nation might be very controversial, but it is something that would probably help a great deal in reducing recidivism. Humanizing corrections so that it is more congruent with community reintegration of inmates remains a primary challenge for advocates of prison reform. Prison reform, not only in terms of the incarceration rate and who is being incarcerated and what they're being incarcerated for, but then the question remains, what do we do with inmates once we have them in our custody in order to encourage rehabilitation rather than incapacitation? Let me know if there's any questions from this. I hope you found some useful information in this presentation. Thank you.